All right, this is our last week on the different areas of acquisition. Starting next week, we'll go on to parent-child interactions, bilingualism, and then look at some atypical kids and compare them to everything that we've learned so far. So I apologize if this one is a little bit terse today. I'm still having some issues, but we will get through this. So our focus today is first of all taking a look at reviewing some of the preferences before birth, or sorry, not before birth, before words with kids. So taking a look at pointing specifically. Then we're going to take a look at some non literal acquisition and then some turn taking. So, as a reminder, we learned very early on that kids have a preference for human speech over just random noises or artificial sounds. So, in other words, children are tuned specifically to children to other speech. What we haven't said necessarily yet is that children also prefer real humans over dolls, toys, and things that look like humans. So when 2-month-olds around this age start interacting with adults, they tend to respond more positively and are more expressive with adults than other toys. And around that same time, children also develop this understanding of what is likely or natural in terms of the interaction. So when parents interact with kids, if they don't respond in a natural or usual way, so like different tone, facial expression, infants tend to show distress. So, what we're seeing very early on is that children are not only tuned into speech, but they really prefer humans. And there's something about the brain that's wired to prefer humans. So, keep this in mind as we go through some of the issues with pointing or some of the theories about pointing. Because, in other words, children are tuned to humans. Okay, so let's say a child, at this point, we'll just say a baby, we'll say like 2 to 4 months, uh, possibly 6 to 8. We're just looking before 9 months at this point. So let's say an adult points at an object and a child goes and retrieves that object that was just pointed at. Okay, so what is happening there? Why is the child retrieving the object? There's two camps for this for interpretations. There's one called the rich interpretation, which is basically saying that the child has a lot of cognitive capacity at this point, and a lean interpretation. So the rich interpretation is saying that at this age, before 9 months, the child knows the intent of the adult pointing at the object. In other words, they're pointing at the object. What they're saying is, I need you to interact with that object. That's why I'm pointing at it. So at this point, they're basically saying, yeah, children know the intent of the person who's pointing, so children are responding to the intent. They want them to go retrieve the object. The lean interpretation is saying, well, okay, it's actually not that complicated. It's just that people point at objects that are interesting. So the child has learned that whenever someone points at something, that's interesting visually for them or interesting in some other way. So when an adult points at that object, they go and respond to the pointing because it's interesting. So the fact that they're retrieving it isn't because they know the intent of the adult. They're simply responding to the fact that, okay, that the adult is pointing at something interesting. Now I'm interested in it, so I'm going to go take a look at it. Okay. So which interpretation seems to be a little bit better? Well, let's get some more information first. So between 9 to 12 months, they call this the 9-month revolution. Infants do achieve some new abilities that could point to a rich interpretation. So one is joint engagement. This is not joint attention, this is joint engagement. This means that a child can shift between objects and toys. So they can play with a toy and watch an adult at the same time. So in other words, they have the capacity to shift attention between two things. They learn to multitask essentially at this age. So they can interact with objects and they can look at adults at the same time, which could say, okay, if intent is something that they can like look at and understand, They have the capacity at this point because they can go between adult and toy, adult and toy, adult and toy. Okay. They also have the ability to follow focus and gaze. So when they see an adult or someone looking at something or turning their head towards it, the child now understands at this point, okay, I am going to also look at and focus on the same thing. This is a little bit questionable, as we'll see, but this ability has been demonstrated in a certain capacity. Okay. They also learn to do their own points. So they're able to point at objects to direct attention from other people. So before this period, they're just responding to points, and at this point, they're actually doing points themselves. So we'll really cover these two bits in detail, and this is going to give us some more information about the interpretations. Because if they're going to do something, that would imply that they have some understanding of what they're responding to. So if they point in a way that shows intent, then okay, maybe there's a rich interpretation that's okay. So some of the people in the lean interpretation camp are just saying, look, this is not responding to intentions, they're just responding to objects. So this is saying, like, no, they're just looking at something interesting and they're responding to it. Now, why might this be better than a rich interpretation? Well, someone did a study with eye gazes, and they found that adults who look at specific things. Okay, so let's say an adult is staring at a cat. If if we get a gaze from the adult plus a head turn, then the child will respond to that and they will look at the same thing too. At 18 months. So this is 9 months after the 9-month revolution. If there's a gaze and a head turn towards an object from an adult, the child will look at that too. If there is no gaze, sorry, if there is no head turn and all there is a gaze from the parent, then at 18 months, children will not look at the same thing. So in other words, a gaze needs to be followed with a head turn at 18 months for the majority of, consistent gaze. So in other words, joint attention between adult and child. Okay. So because of this weakens the claim that children understand intent because we need like a large physical response in order to get that same looking pattern. In other words, the children are not paying as much attention to the eyes and the focus as researchers originally believed. Okay, so the gaze thing is saying we actually need more physical movement, and it's still at 18 months. So maybe the gaze is not good evidence for a rich interpretation with intent because it the rich interpretation requires more cognitive power than what children are responding to at 18 months. Okay, what about pointing? So we can classify points into two different types. There's proto-imperative points, and remember, imperative, based on terminology you would have learned in syntax, these are like commands. So these are when children want something. And then there's declarative points. So these are just pointing out objects or like interaction. This isn't for demanding something. This is just pointing like, oh, this is interesting. So under a rich interpretation, these two different points have different focuses. The imperative point is self-centered. It's like the child wants something. This is for them. While the declarative points would be communicative. This is saying like, listen, my intent is to show you, the parent, that something is new, that you haven't seen this. Just like you're pointing at things that I haven't seen because you want my attention, like you want me to look at it and interact with it. I'm going to do those points so that way you do the same thing. Well, a lean interpretation is not saying that proto-declarative points are commutative, they're saying they're self-centered. So there's really a difference in these declarative points. Imperative with commands, they're always going to be self-centered, even for adults. So why might a proto-declarative point be self-centered? Well, what we see is that children point at what we call old things. So, if an adult and child are in the room together, a child will point at something they find interesting, even if the adult has already seen it. So, this is not like I'm pointing at this for communicative purposes because I want you to see something new. This is, I find this thing interesting. Therefore, I'm going to point at it and I want you to look at it, even if you know it already exists. Okay. So, we see this pattern a lot, which leads us to say maybe the lean interpretation is just a little bit more reasonable at this point. Okay. But we have two more experiments here, and maybe we can find some nuance in this. So I want you to think about whether or not the lean or rich interpretation is good for both of these experiments. So either one. So you can pause, try it yourself, but let me talk about it. So in 2011, pair researchers found that 1-year-olds point at objects parents have already seen, while 2-year-olds point at objects that they haven't seen. So what this experiment is showing really is that there's a little bit more nuance. The 1-year-olds seem to be showing this lean interpretation, while 2-year-olds tend to be showing a more rich interpretation. So it's not communicative at 1-year-old, but at 2 years old, maybe it's a little bit more communicative. Okay, what about the second one? 1-year-olds are not happy when pointing to an object and the parent ignores the object or does not comment on it. So, so this is pretty neutral on the 2 points. A 1-year-old is pointing at something, the parent is not interacting with it. So whether or not it's communicative or self-centered, I think children will respond the same way. In other words, they're pointing at something. If they're self-centered and they want, you know, they think this is interesting, and then the child parent doesn't respond. Okay, that's not great. If a child points and says, "I want you to look at this," and the parent doesn't respond, then okay, it's not going to be okay either. So if anything, what additional experiments are going to show is that maybe there's a both lean and rich interpretation, and children go through development. They start with a lean interpretation, and then they get richer as they develop more cognitive abilities. Okay, so that's it for pointing. There's a lot more experiments on pointing. I was going to find some articles on that for you all, but focused more on the other things for those SLP people who want atypical children. So if you want more pointing stuff, I can find more pointing stuff. But let's move on to scalar implicature. So this is non-literal meaning. I need to explain what this is first in case you haven't taken semantics or if you didn't cover this in LING 220. An implicature is something that is implied, but not necessarily true. So in other words, it's like a convention of language that we expect. We have expectations about meaning, but the expectations can be broken. So we call this a scalar implicature because we're taking a look at words on scale. So something like bad to good or none to all. So some examples here. If you say, I got some of them right, the intended meaning is that you did not get all of them right, but maybe you did. So I got some of them right. In fact, I got all of them right. So it can mean that you did not get all of them right, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. But the expectation when you say that is that you did not get all of them right. Just like if you say something was good, the expectation means that it was not great, but you could say it was good. And in fact, it was fantastic. Okay, and the reason these implicatures come to be is because of Grice's maximum quantity. If you still believe in that, we'll go with it. I shouldn't say if you still believe. If you're in the camp that believes in the maxims, great. If you're not, then I don't know. There's other ways to get to this, but typical way. Speakers should be as informative as necessary, no more, no less. So the idea is that because you're not saying that you got all of them right, that means that you did not get all of them right. You're saying some because you couldn't say all. Okay. So what I want you to get at is that if there's an if you say a word on a scale, you're implying that you're not above that word in the scale because you didn't say something more. So by saying you got some of them right, you're saying that because you did not get all of them right. Okay. So the question is, when can children do this and how do they treat these sentences? So imagine, this is a real experiment by Novak, that you're looking at a bunch of different pictures, or you're looking at real world knowledge, and you're given a statement. So here's the statement: some giraffes have long necks. Now, you know that a better way to say this would say all giraffes have long necks. I know there might be exceptions, but generally all giraffes have long necks. So you're asked whether or not that sentence is true. Some giraffes have long necks. Now, 59% of adults say that this is false, and it's false because, well, all giraffes have long necks. But only 15% of children are saying it's false. But what's interesting is that logically, if we just remove all conversational expectations out of here, this statement is true. Okay, so children are actually performing better on this task than adults. But the expectation with language is that if you say some, you're saying not all. So what this means is that 60% of adults are just taking that conversational expectation. They're saying, well, by saying some, you mean not all, and that's false. So 60% of adults are saying that. 15% of children are just saying it's not false. It's actually logically true. Maybe it's not logically true, but they're just not applying the implicature. Okay, so what this means is that children just don't have this implicature yet. They don't have this non-literal meaning. They're taking things very literally. And as you go on from 5 years old to 9 years old, children become more adult-like, and this happens across languages as well. Okay, so one suggestion for this is what's called the pragmatic limitations hypothesis. So the idea is that, okay, if you're doing scalar implicature, this takes effort, and children don't have practice yet, therefore they don't, get at the same point. Okay, so they behave differently from adults because they just don't have practice. Well, Francis and Bishop in 2011 had some responses and said, okay, well, maybe it's not just a practice thing. Maybe children are reserving falsity for things that are obviously false. So, in other words, their requirements for something that are false need to be like very clearly false. Otherwise, it's true. So, something that happens most of the time or is like 70% correct, maybe that's okay. Maybe that's still true. Okay. So, if you say some giraffes have 25 legs, then they would say that's false. The other suggestion is that, well, maybe children are tolerating these underinformative utterances, but false ones are still called out. So in other words, when you say some, and you're talking about a group of like a bunch of different things, if you say some, I mean it's still true because it's just underinformative. You're just not covering the whole thing like you should be, and that's still okay. You're still there. You're just not saying something false. Okay, so this pragmatics limitations hypothesis, is it really a practice effect, or is it just that children have different boundaries for what is true or false and what they tolerate? Okay, so this is still one of the theories out there, still in effect, or still being tested, but I mean, it's interesting in a way because this is a question between feedback, language use, and just something cognitively different with children. So it's two very different camps in this respect. One needs to be tested in terms of truth and falsity in the representation of the world, and the other one is simply a practice effect. Okay, so moving on to reference words. Reference words are words that refer to people in the real world. So if he is referring to some person out there, then he is basically a substitute for whatever person should be there. Okay, so he is taking me to Starbucks. I have a cat. The cat is very important. Can you pass me the other drink? So reference words rely on accessibility. What this means is that you need to be aware of context. So in other words, with the word like other, you need to know that there are two drinks. If you don't know there's two drinks, then other doesn't make any sense. You also need to know information about what the listener knows. So if you're going to use a reference word, the listener that you're speaking to better be aware that that reference exists. Otherwise, there's an issue. If you just start saying he randomly to someone who doesn't know what you're talking about, they're not going to know who he is. Okay, so reference words require like some understanding between adult and child. So a researcher in 2007 found that reference words in Korean Inuktitut and Italian can be omitted if references are obvious. So we can't do this in English, but if he has been established earlier in the sentence, you can just drop the subject or the object entirely. So children will do this if the referent is easily accessible. So in other words, if the context allows it, children will do it. But they won't do it if the referent is not yet part of the conversation. So even in a physical room, if you have a person here and you could say he, children will not do it unless that person's name has been brought up in the conversation before, about half the time. So it seems kind of random. Maybe there's a principles and parameters explanation going on here, but it seems kind of random. Children tend to produce over informative sentences. So in other words, introducing the referent more than you need to. Okay. So this is like saying we've already said he in Korean, we don't need to say it again, but children are going to do it anyway. So this concept of newness, this concept of reference, like understanding when something is new to the discourse or not, happens around 7 years of age. So these errors start to decrease around that age when a full understanding of discourse comes in. So let's think about this. Why might children omit reference words when they need to be there? And there's two possible explanations. I think both of these are not good. So children use their gaze to denote a new referent without words, and children use gestures. So the idea is that for both of these, you need a context that is physical. You can't introduce a referent by gazing or looking at something, and you can't introduce a referent by using gestures unless that thing is there. Okay, so children don't do this all the time. Therefore, it's not a good explanation as to why children might make errors and omit reference words more than they need to. Even though children tend to use them more often than not, children do omit things at certain points. So, there's a lot of variable patterns here. Basically, children are playing around and trying to figure out what's appropriate from a principles and parameters point of view. Okay. So here's an interesting thing. When parents and children attend to the same thing, referent errors actually increase. So children will use it more than required or less than required. But it's interesting because at this point, the child and the parent are looking at the same thing. They know about the same things. So why are referent errors increasing? Well, Matthews et al. Had an answer to this. And this is like saying children have sensitivity to two factors. One is perceptual availability. So this is now understanding between listener and speaker. So it's understanding what the listener's done. And then prior mention. So has the referent already been named before? So maybe these two things are interacting with the error somehow. So let's just show that these things first work. Okay, so here's an experiment for perceptual availability. So a child is watching and describing a video, and there's a researcher or listener behind the television or in front of the television. So in other words, they're testing whether or not the child changes their description of a story based on whether the listener can or can't see. And taking a look at how many reference words were included. So if you're 2 years old, there's not really a difference between the can and can't see group. So whether the listener is beside you or behind the TV, they're not changing the amount of reference words. Now at 3 and 4 years old, this now changes. If the person can't see the TV, the children are now using more reference words because they're trying to communicate the fact that, that they can't see what's going on, so they need to repeat the reference words over and over again. Need to use them more. Okay, so it seems like around 3 years old, children are tuned in a little bit to what the listener knows and what they don't know. What about for prior mention? So now a second experimenter is commenting on the video. So in one case, the experimenter is introducing the referent. So in other words, that they're saying it before the question. And in another one, they're not saying it at all. So are they introducing the referent or not? Because if they introduce the referent, the idea is that, well, now children don't have to use it as often. But if they haven't introduced it, then children need to establish it on their own. So taking a look at ages 2, 3, and 4, if the referent is not given by the researcher, they do produce it more. And if it's given by the researcher, so already established by somebody else, then they produce it less. Children at 3 and 4 produce it at a way less rate. 2-year-olds still show a difference. So yeah, prior mention comes in around 2 years old. Perceptual availability is around 3 years old. Now, what these two say in terms of this joint attention issue is that depending on the age, perceptual availability may not be there yet. So they may still use it more or less than necessary with an adult. Prior mention is already there. But just because they understand these things does not mean that they're going to use them appropriately. Okay, we can still make errors. Children can still test things out. There may also be some cognitive overload going on just because they're doing so much at once. They're both attending to something at the same time, and the child basically has to go back and forth between, well, how much does the listener know as they update, as they watch? So there's like a continuous time event there rather than just a conversation about something in the past. Okay, so that's reference words. We're going to end with some turn taking. This is interesting, and you'll see this in the parent-child interaction next week. We'll talk more about this and see this in action. So researchers believe that turn taking starts from birth. And a parent will be like, oh, what a nice smile. And then the response will be a smile. Okay, so this is like understanding turn taking in a very, very basic sense of there's a behavior and I respond to it. Behavior, I respond to it. And usually in the first bit, adults are the ones who are starting the conversations and maintaining them. Okay, so a lot of it is adult started, but children also tend to make a lot of noises, right? The noises of distress, noises of happiness, and so on, and parents tend to respond to that noise. So what these are these are patterns in response. So an adult might say something, and the child responds, and they say something again, they wait for a response, and so on. With noises, now children are kind of controlling it, and adults are responding to it. So there's some notion of turn taking, at least waiting for a response from birth. Okay. So when is turn taking successful? Okay, if the child waits their turn and contributes relevant information. So 2-year-olds tend to take appropriate turns around 90% of the time with their parents. Okay, so 2-year-olds are pretty good at turn taking. But when children around the same age are joining into other conversations, so people who are not their parents, they tend to not contribute as relevantly. So usually only half the time it seems to be relevant. So whether turn taking is fully acquired at 2 years old, this is a little bit questionable. Sure, they're waiting their turn, but they're not necessarily being relevant all the time. And part of turn taking is being cooperative, right? If you're having a conversation, like be on task. In terms of timing, there's some interesting things, and we'll see this with even autistic adults a little bit later that they struggle with this. But usually, there's about a 0.25-second gap between speaker turns and conversation. So between someone talking and someone else starting to talk, it's like less than a quarter of a second. So if you're not following this pattern, sometimes it feels a little bit awkward in conversation, or you can reason it with other things like maybe they're thinking, maybe they're a slow thinker, but a typical conversation about a quarter of a second between turns. 3-year-olds take way longer, 1.5 seconds. So what is it that, like, what can we say at this point? Okay, 3-year-olds probably don't turn take like adults, obviously, with the longer time. But like, why is that? Okay, so one explanation is like maybe they do have it acquired. Maybe they could do 0.25 seconds, but adults are doing something that children aren't. And adults are really great at saying nothing. By saying nothing, I mean that they talk, but nothing really means anything. They're using fillers. So, in other words, they're using words like yeah, so they're trying to signal that they are going to start or continue their turn. Okay. So, children just don't have that yet. Like they don't have the fillers to say I'm going to speak, so they're not shortening that time. And maybe they also can't anticipate when speakers are ending their turn. So maybe like we know that, okay, there are some signals that say a speaker's turn is going to end. A little child is like, okay, they're at this point, but they can't tell that it's about to end. So they need to react to this new bit. And a filler word could also help adults, even if they don't know, say, listen, I would like to start speaking here. I'm going to say this at this point, and then you're going to stop your turn. Okay. So A lot of the stuff with pragmatics, taking a look at a lot of different ages. So, like 1 year to 7 years, taking a look at the different experiments. Looking at this in terms of just language can be very hard because there's a lot of cognitive overload that's happening with children at different ages. You're doing conversation, you have memory, you have attention, you have language production, language comprehension. All of this is going on at the same time. And then you're also adding in real world expectations. Okay, so it's a very messy period. Children are at very different stages of development over time here. There's a lot of variation, but overall, this is the basic of pragmatics. We'll continue this next week, looking at specifically at interaction, where we can see a lot of these things and also talk about storytelling and so on.